All right, Mr. Parnassus, why don't you tell us about what you do for a living?
Hear me now, children, for my occupation is of much import. For 82 years, I've been an oil man, a baron, some have called me. Now, what does an oil baron do? The answer? Crush your enemies! Grind their bones into dirt! Make them regret they were ever born!
Wow, right into the dirt. Now, if the kids want to pursue a career in oil, what kind of traits would serve them well?
Oil is not for the weak. It is the earth's milk, and only the strong may suckle at mother's teat.
I want to be you when I grow up.
And so you shall! Now, children, I was asked to bring a healthy snack, so join me in the hall for swine livers and Capri Sun.
Hey Exiles, Chronic Painless here to tell you the truth about crop rotation, because you might not like it, but this is what peak crop rotation looks like. I know it's counterintuitive, but believe it or not, you actually want a small plurality of yellow crops in order to maximize your expected value when harvesting in the Sacred Grove. But before I say anything else, I need to establish two preconditions that must be met in order for what I'm saying to actually be true. The first of those is that we must have access to the imbued harvest mapcraft option on our map device so that we can have a 50% increased chance of our crops not wilting, as well as the 50% chance for an additional monster. This will stack with the 10% chance that we get for each of these things coming from our Atlas passive tree, giving us a 60% chance total for each of them. As long as we have this, and as long as yellow juice is worth at least 1.5 times as much as purple and blue are much closer to each other than they are to yellow, then everything that I am saying will be true. So if those two preconditions are met, then you can go ahead and watch the rest of this video. But if you're watching this in the future and Horn Scarabs of Awakening don't exist, or the imbued harvest has been changed, or the economy is in shambles, then you can go ahead and stop watching this video now. But assuming that you can still get that 60% no wilt, 60% additional monster, and that yellow juice is still worth targeting, then what I am saying is definitely applicable. And trust me, I have the receipts, I have run the simulations, I've collected the data, I've put the theory into practice, as have many other blasters from the stream and the Discord, and the results are palpable. This is definitely the best way to maximize your gains when you are crop rotating. And if you're willing to take my word for it, go ahead and skip to the next chapter of the video. But if you need a little more convincing, allow me to elaborate. First off, I completely understand the conventional wisdom that you want to make yellow crops the minority in your sacred groves because you want to have the greatest chance to upgrade them. Crop rotation lets us increase the tier values of our plants when we harvest other colors. So assuming we want the most yellow, we want to upgrade it a lot, which means we want the most other colors. I get that reasoning. However, if you actually look at the math, if you actually collect the data, you will see that you will get far better results from a slight plurality of yellow juice. And there are many reasons for that. I first came to this conclusion when developing a simulation that would create random sacred groves and then harvest them based on our best understanding of the current probabilities in play and my best expected value maximizing strategy when it came to harvest ordering and even reordering, looking at how the actual upgrades and no wilts were playing out within each grove and possibly changing course if the odds suggested that that was a better option. And after putting this through countless checks and rounds of debugging and making sure that as I peered under the hood and looked at the simulation and made sure that it was making all the decisions that I would make, I let it go and had it run through millions of groves in every possible weighting distribution that you could get from the different points in the passive tree here. And what I found over and over again was that the slight plurality yellow strategy won the day. And not only that, but heavily minimizing yellow was actually the worst strategy in almost every circumstance. What you want is something much closer to a balance, and ideally something with a little emphasis on yellow. And I was shocked when I got this conclusion. I spent the next several weeks doing everything I could to poke holes in it, try to find where I must have gone wrong, checking it and rechecking it, slicing up the data in every possible way imaginable to try to expose the situation that I must have somehow been mishandling or misinterpreting. And that was what was causing this surprising result. And I could not find anything to suggest that this was not the right answer. In fact, the more I looked at it, the more evidence I got that this was just true. And I think I can finally explain why that might be the case and why our intuitions about reducing yellow fully in order to maximize the chance to upgrade it are a little bit off base. There are a few factors here, and they're all very much interrelated. So I'll just start by saying one of the main reasons that I think people are overvaluing the minimal yellow strategy is that they are overvaluing tier 4 seeds in general. Now, if you set the simulation to value tier 4 seeds to be several hundred times the value of a tier 3 seed, which is obviously not the case, I would estimate it to be somewhere between 2 and 4 times in reality, but you would have to set it to be upwards of 40 times more valuable. And at that point, indeed, having a small amount of yellow crops does become more beneficial than having a slight plurality, because getting those tier 4s becomes very valuable, and so you need lots and lots of upgrades. However, in practice, tier 3 seeds are really where the money is, and so having a lot of tier 3 seeds is far better than having a few tier 4 seeds. And the reason for that also goes in to another thing that is confounding our intuitions, which is the horned scarab of awakening. Not only is this giving us the chance for our crops not to wilt at a much higher rate, making risking yellow crops much more viable, and therefore having a lot of yellow crops much more beneficial, it also gives us that 60% chance for an additional monster, which does not apply to tier 4 seeds. Tier 4 seeds can sometimes spawn 2 monsters, but in order to do so, they have to proc the chance for a duplicated monster, which is about 6% coming from the Atlas passive tree. And if you actually do a bunch of harvests, you'll certainly see that you are definitely not getting an additional boss 60% or even close to 60%, not even 10% of the time, but it is about that 6% number that you will see 2 bosses coming out of a single tier 4 seed. So while tier 3 seeds are getting a huge benefit from this, they are also benefiting from lots of pack size. The more pack size you have, the more likely you are to get multiple monsters coming out of a tier 3 seed, but there is no amount of pack size that will ever get you an additional boss to come out of the seed with any more regularity than the duplication proc. So even though tier 4 monsters drop piles of life force that are about 5 times larger than a tier 3 monster will drop, and they can also drop the Sacred Blossom that gets you the Sacred Crystallized life force, the chances for that are fairly low, and the fact that every tier 3 seed is spawning at least 2, probably 2.5 monsters on average, the ratio of value from a tier 4 to tier 3 seed is much closer to somewhere between 2 and 4 times. And this high value of tier 3 seeds also feeds in to the next point that I think may have led our intuitions astray, which is the value of lots of crops with a few upgrades as opposed to a few crops with lots of upgrades. Squares are the biggest numbers. When you are ratcheting one multiplier up to ratchet another multiplier down, you will usually find the best result when you are looking at the perfect square. 5 times 5 is bigger than 6 times 4 is bigger than 7 times 3. While it might be tempting to try to make the biggest single crop you can possibly make, you are almost always better off getting one more crop with one less upgrade on each of your crops in the vast majority of situations. You would rather have 2 crops upgraded 6 times than 1 crop upgraded 7 times. You would rather have 3 crops upgraded 4 times than 2 crops upgraded 5 times. You have to get down to a very low number of total upgrades in order for this rule to break. And so overall, having even 3, 4, even 5 yellow crops is significantly better than having just 1 yellow crop. And it is also very important to avoid having no yellow crops when yellow is very valuable. And that is just another reason why having this slight plurality yellow really does win the day in the end. Lastly, I think our intuitions are generally failing us when it comes to evaluating the risk reward of putting yellow crops up for a chance to wilt or a chance to upgrade those yellow crops. When you actually run the numbers, I think you'll be very surprised to see how often you should be risking those crops for the sake of upgrading them. I was surprised. The numbers just say basically full send in just about every scenario. I will break down, obviously, the finer points of that later on in the video. But suffice to say, in general, you will almost certainly be risking a lot more than might seem intuitively comfortable. So how does it actually work? Well, aside from getting this color weighting distribution, we of course are going to want to get all of the other harvest passive points on the tree, even the ones that seem like they don't necessarily help that much with crop rotation, such as the tier 3 plant chance, and this one with the increased chance for a tier 4 plant, because that 10% chance for not wilting is very important. Getting us from 50 to 60% is a big benefit, and so definitely worth spending these few points here. We of course also are going to want as much chance as we can for an additional monster, duplicated monsters, more life force, and additional harvest. This is absolutely essential. This is what takes us to that chance of getting a 5-plot harvest, which is where the value truly lies for crop rotation, because the more crops you have at play, the more upgrades you get, and the more upgraded crops you get to actually harvest. So the difference in value between a 3-plot and a 5-plot grove is massive, and you've got to get this bumper crop notable if you want to get to 5 plots. We're also, of course, going to be maximizing all of the map modifier effect that we possibly can. And then after that, there is really not much that you can do for the sake of juicing up the harvest itself. I've done a lot of testing around this, and the only factors that determine how much life force you will get out of a given grove are the quantity on the map and the pack size on the map. The more map quantity you get, including from Eldritch Altars, the better you will do. The more pack size you have, the more monsters will spawn out of the tier 2 and tier 3 seeds, and the better you will do. Things that have no effect include player quant, which you can't get from gear anymore, but you can still get from things like a covetous shrine, like a glittering scarab, but none of that will help. Delirium will not help. Wildwood wisps do not help. Additional modifiers from a nemesis scarab also do not help. Literally the only thing that you can possibly do in order to juice up your harvest is get lots of pack size and lots of quantity on the map itself. And so to push our pack size and quantity to the limit, we are going to be running 8 mod jungle valleys. I like to chisel them up and roll them myself and give the ones that don't turn into 8 mods to my mappers. And then we are going to want to add the scarabs of risk, as many as we can, because of course we're going to need the scarab of awakening as well as the harvest scarab of doubling in order to maximize our gains. But the rest of our scarabs we're going to want to be scarabs of risk, because these will massively increase our map quant as well as our pack size, giving us that extra explicit effect and taking us to even higher levels of mods. If your build cannot yet run scarabs of risk, it's okay. You can still profit a lot from this strategy to substitute in monstrous lineage and influenced hordes in order to maximize your eldritch altars. We of course are going to be running the Eater of Worlds to maximize our gains from the quantity altars, and Jungle Valley will aid with that as well, since we will not see any boss reward options on the altars that do spawn. That's all for the basic setup. So now we need to talk about how you actually go about harvesting crops in the right order in order to maximize your gains, because there is definitely an art and a science to this, and if you do it the wrong way, you will not see the promised gains. So first, let's talk about how you set up your initial order or how you are thinking about going through the grove. Now, depending on the grove, this could be subject to change if the RNG rolls one way or another, but for the most part, you'll be able to pick a path and follow that path all the way to the end. And we start building that path by looking at non-yellow crops and seeing which of purple and blue there is more of. If there is more of one than the other, we will start with that color that is more common because we want to ensure that of those secondary non-yellow colors, we are at least getting some value, and getting at least a few upgrades rather than just one or two upgrades is going to be the best way to do that. If it's a tie between purple and blue, I would defer towards purple first because blue is usually slightly more valuable and therefore more worth getting upgraded blue crops. Another potential tiebreaker is which of the secondary colors is next to more yellow crops. If there are two or fewer yellow crops in play and only one of the secondary colors is next to those, I might avoid starting with that color because of some of the other principles that we're going to talk about later, which are deleting doubles and deferring decisions. But the first thing you want to do is just isolate the secondary color that is the most common, start with that, then the other secondary color, and finish up with yellow. If you just do that with no reordering at all, with no regard for expected value past that point and how the RNG actually plays out, you will capture a substantial amount of the potential value, but it is still worth doing some fiddling here and there in order to really squeeze that last bit of juice out of your groves. Breaking down the order a little further, you want to always start with doubles. Doubles are not decisions. You defer decisions down the road. The reason for that is the groves with the crop rotation have a huge amount of RNG, massive variance in how the upgrades and wilting or no wilting will play out. And so making sure that your strategy can be responsive to that when possible is highly beneficial. And to do that, you need to defer decisions, which are deciding between crops of two different colors in the same plot, until later when you have more information. Once more of the RNG has actually played out, you can make a more informed decision about whether or not you actually risk that yellow crop for the sake of upgrading it. But in a vacuum, you won't necessarily know what to do, so start with the doubles, delete them first because two crops of the same color in the same plot are essentially the same. And as for those decisions, there are just a couple of rules of thumb that you want to keep in mind when deciding whether or not to risk that yellow crop. If there is only one yellow crop left in the grove, what you are looking for is a ratio of tier 2 to tier 3 seeds of 3 to 1. If there's greater than 3 to 1 ratio of tier 2 to tier 3 seeds, it is worth risking that crop for the sake of upgrading itself. Risking tier 2 seeds is worthwhile because they have a very good chance of turning into tier 3 seeds. However, risking tier 3 seeds is not worthwhile because they are very valuable and have a very small chance of turning into tier 4 seeds. So the more tier 3 seeds you have, the less attractive risking the crop is, and the more tier 2 seeds, the more attractive it is, and the math works out to be about a 3 to 1 ratio, maybe 3.5 to 1, depending on how you rate the difference between a tier 3 and tier 4 seed. Next, we have situations where there are two yellow crops still in play, one that is being put at risk and one that is in a separate plot. When this is the case, the expected value calculation can get a lot more complicated and hairy. So in general, a good rule of thumb to go by is that it is only worth cashing out, it is only worth taking that yellow crop and not risking it for the sake of upgrading itself and the other yellow crop if there are at least 7, maybe even 8 tier 3 seeds in it. It is very unlikely that you'll find a situation with anything less than that where it is not mathematically advantageous to go ahead and just risk that crop for the sake of upgrading not only itself, but also the other yellow crop that is still in the grove. And if there are 3 or more yellow crops still in the grove, just send it. Don't even worry about it. Don't even think about it. Just gamble it, because you would have to go extremely far out of your way to contrive a high number of standard deviations away from the norm result in order to have a crop that was juicy enough to just barely tip the scales in favor of it being worth taking that crop rather than risking it for the sake of upgrades. And in those situations, even when the decision says cash out, it will only be doing so by the tiniest margin. It is much more likely that you will be looking at a crop where it is a no-brainer to risk it. And so just go ahead and do that. And the very small percentage of the time that you're making a very tiny expected value losing mistake by not cashing out is not worth getting a headache over. Obviously, if there are 4 or more yellows, that it's even less of a decision. There truly is not a contrived RNG scenario where it would ever be worth not risking a yellow crop for the sake of upgrading itself and 3 others. This same rule can also apply to the secondary colors. If you're in a grove that has a lot of plots in it and you're getting a lot of no wilts, you may find yourself in a situation where you have some yellow crops still left, but you're deciding between a blue and a purple, and you need to decide if you want to risk that blue for the sake of upgrading itself, or just take it now. And the same 3-to-1 rule approximately will apply, as will the 7 or 8 tier 3s in order to not risk one if there are still 2 blues in play. Of course, you're not going to run into a whole lot of scenarios like that, and most of the time you're just going to be doing a full send on anything that isn't a yellow crop. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be wondering, can you do this in T17s? Should you do this in T17s? Why aren't I doing this in T17s? And there are a few answers to that. Number one, tier 17 maps baseline are extremely expensive. Compared to even chiseling and rolling your own 8 mod maps, the cost of just the tier 17 map alone is going to massively impact your overall divs per hour, and you will probably not get enough life force extra out of that T17 map in order to justify the base cost of the map. Now, of course, you still are running a tier 17 map, which does have benefits. However, if you are spending a lot of your passive points on juicing up the harvest, if you're using the harvest juicing scarabs, then you are not going to see the same returns from the rest of the map that people who are more than willing to pay those prices for them are seeing by running their scarab or currency-based strategies. Another factor is that the tier 17 maps are going to always have the boss altars in play. We're going to get those boss drop rewards on our blue altars, hindering the amount of quantity altars that we can get, whereas the Jungle Valley avoids that. There's a limited degree to which you can even rush the boss on a tier 17 map, and so even though the baseline quantity on the tier 17 is likely going to be much higher, the benefit from these altars is going to be very substantial and likely close that gap to a pretty significant degree. Another factor is the scarabs of risk. These are pushing the pack size of our tier 16 maps to just about 100%, which is where the linear scaling seems to break down. It seems like up to 100% pack size, that is basically your chance of spawning another monster from each seed that is not a tier 4 seed. Pack size, of course, does not affect tier 4 seeds. And so once we get to that 100% number, it really starts having diminishing returns. And so even though tier 17 maps can have close to 200% pack size when rolled the right way and with the pack size chisels on them, you're not going to see worthwhile returns from that when it comes to your harvest. And so overall, it is just a better idea to stick to the T16s. They're easier, they're faster, and the returns are likely comparable for far less initial expenditure. One last thing before I demonstrate this, I have to say it, this strategy has extremely high variance. If you are risk averse, if you are someone with a small bankroll who can't afford to weather a potential unlucky streak, this is probably not a good strategy for you. So what might this all look like in practice? Well, here we are in a very potentially juicy Sacred Grove. And the first thing we're going to look at is which non-yellow color is more common? And the answer is purple. And we are not going to be dissuaded from starting with purple first, even though there is more purple on the yellow. So we'll have to put more yellow at risk early because there is so much yellow in play here that we know it is going to be worth going full send no matter what happens with the wilting or no wilting or upgrades on these crops, because there's just so much yellow in play that the risk is always going to be justified. And so we'll still start over here. I will double check. Still going to want to risk the less juicy of the yellows. Whichever one has less potential is going to be the one that I put at risk first. Not that I'm not going to be risking both of them, but just in case of that 1 in a million shot. And we didn't get the 1 in a million shot, so we will go ahead and send it on that. All right, and now we will come over here and start collecting the blues. Of course, we're going to start with the safe one that is not putting any yellow at risk, because we want to get as much information as possible. Not that we're going to need that information because there's so much yellow in play, but always hedging against that 1 in a million shot that this is going to roll 17 tier 3 seeds. No, but it did not. It rolled 7. Seems like a lot. I know many people would be very tempted to cash out on this because this is a lot of juice. This is probably a divine and a half worth of yellow juice. However, there are so many yellow crops in play that I promise you the expected value that we will gain from upgrading these yellow plots for sure is going to be absolutely worth the chance that this plot will wilt. The chances that this plot will wilt if we choose this one is too much to risk. We get way more value from the upgrade than we do from just this plot, and so we cannot risk this. We have to take it. We have to get that upgrade, even if it means potentially losing out on all of that juice. And most of the time, you won't lose out on it because you are more likely than not, 60% of the time, it will not wilt. But we're not going to be results oriented. That was the right decision, even if it did wilt. And the fact that it didn't just means that we get even more juice. And now we will reap what we have sown. We have maximized our gains. We went full send, right? We had to risk 3 yellow crops. We put 3 yellow crops at risk of wilting. Fortunately, they all survived. But even if they didn't, we would still be getting huge returns on this map, because we would have several yellows left no matter what. Even if all 3 of them wilted, we would still have those 2 up there, which would be very, very juicy, and we would be quite happy. So believe it or not, the actual optimal expected value harvest has 4 yellow crops in it. 5 is only just slightly worse, and 3 is only just slightly worse. But the winner of the highest expected value grove will have 4 yellow crops in it, assuming that yellow is about 1.5 to 2.5 times as much as the others. Okay, it's beefier than the boss. So, Namharim, I have good news. I believe we may have cracked the secret to getting him to behave. It seems like, and shout out to Dirty Sugar from the Twitch chat for pointing this out, that he only turns into a tree when he has enough space. So you have to get him away from the walls, away from the fences, if he seems to be misbehaving. So here we have, once again, very juicy stuff. I'll defer the one with more tier 2s is slightly juicier. Unfortunate we didn't get the full 5 no wilt for the ridiculous jackpot, but we are still going to get a lot of juice from this harvest. Because having this many yellow seeds upgraded just a few times is far better than having 1 or 2 yellow crops upgraded a few more times. All right, these got 5 upgrades on them. That is more than enough. And so we are very pleased with what we wound up with here. And there you go. 34,000 yellow life force. Yeah. I'd imagine if we had this plot too, this could have been upwards of 40,000. And in order to get that though, you gotta risk it. And I promise you will never get this much life force from a grove that only had 1 yellow crop in it. Probably not. Yeah, even if you had 2 yellow crops, there's almost no way you're getting this much. You need a lot of yellow in your grove to really see the maximum returns. Don't be seduced by the single crop that is giving you 10,000 juice. Better to have 4 crops giving you 9,000 juice. So just one last summary, trying to put all of these points together in as brief of a time that I can. You start by getting a slight plurality of yellow crops. You have to take at least one thing reduced all the way to reach crop rotation. You want a balance because you want to avoid monochrome groves where you have no potential for upgrades, and you want to skew things slightly in favor of yellow because yellow is where the money is and you need a lot of it in play in order to risk it, in order to harvest it, in order to maximize your gains. And you need to remember that you're going to be going pretty much full send, meaning you're almost always going to be risking yellow crops before cashing out on them, except in a couple of situations. The first is when there is only 1 yellow crop remaining, and in that case, if there are 3 times as many tier 2 seeds as tier 3 seeds, then you want to risk it. But if there are more tier 3 seeds than that, then you want to cash out. If there are 2 yellows, then only cash out if there are at least 7 or 8 tier 3 seeds. And if there are 3 or more yellows, send it. Don't even worry about it, just full send. And I promise you will see great results if you are putting those yellow crops at risk for the sake of upgrading themselves as well as the other yellows in play. And when it comes to setting up your initial harvesting order, start with the non-yellow color that there is more of, and then go to the other non-yellow color, and then of course finish up with yellow. You can break ties by deferring to purple first, because purple is usually slightly less valuable than blue, and therefore it's better to get upgraded blue crops. You can also break ties by looking at which non-yellow color is next to more yellow crops, is putting more yellow crops potentially at risk, and harvest that one second. You want to do this if there are 2 or fewer yellow crops in play, because those are the situations where it might actually be worth potentially cashing out one of those yellow crops or even both. And so you want to defer that decision until as much of the RNG has settled as possible. And so that means starting with the other color first so that you can harvest that color, then harvest whatever of the other color is not putting yellow at risk before finally making that potentially difficult decision over whether or not to risk the yellow crops. And if you are risking yellow crops when there is more than one in play, always try to risk the least juicy of the yellow crops, because the ones that are more juicy have more potential to turn into even better crops as they get upgraded. And so if you are going to ever make a decision where you do want to cash out, it's going to involve those crops. So keep them until more of the RNG has settled and you're able to make a more informed decision. That's all I've got for this video. If you do try this strategy out, please try to keep in mind how much of a factor the number of plots you're actually getting in your groves will be in the overall returns. So if you are going to try to draw a comparison between this strat and another strat, try to do so between sets of maps that have approximately the same baseline juiciness before you go and draw conclusions. There will be huge variance. Most of you will be very satisfied with the results you get. Some of you will be on the low end of the variance curve. Some of you will think that I am a super genius and why haven't you been doing this forever and ever, because you'll get fantastic results. Most people, though, will get pretty good returns, better returns than they were getting with their yellow reducing strat, especially if you were going full yellow reduction with no mitigation whatsoever. That is absolutely the worst strategy to do in every scenario, unless tier 4 seeds are worth 100 times as much as a tier 3 seed.